I always thought that the hardest challenge in my life was my parents' divorce. It was a time when home suddenly stopped being the place where you're expected to be. Dinner conversations turned into awkward silences, and love, which had seemed so solid, suddenly crumbled like old plaster falling off the walls. But it turned out that the worst was yet to come. When Mom announced that she was getting married to someone she'd known for only a few months, I felt a strange mix of anger, fear, and exhaustion. It seemed like I was being torn away from my familiar life again, without anyone asking if I wanted that. His name was Daniel. He was the complete opposite of my father: balanced, calm, reserved, as if nothing could ever shake him. Mom said that it was exactly this in him that attracted her: reliability, stability, predictability. To me, he just seemed boring. Moving to a small town was another blow. I was used to the noise, the people, the feeling of life around me. Here it was quiet. Too quiet. The streets seemed empty and the passersby too watchful. On the first day, I went for a walk and I caught so many eyes on me that I just wanted to turn around and lock myself in my room. I didn't want to leave, but I had no other choice. Financially, I couldn't afford my own apartment, and staying alone in the big city after Mom left would have been strange. So I accepted it. Our new home was on the outskirts, a two-story house with a small garden and even an old garage that Daniel used as a workshop. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, like a picture from an advertising brochure for the perfect life. But I knew no beautiful picture could replace what I had lost. A few weeks after the move, I started to get used to my new life, but it was more of an acceptance than true adaptation. The days stretched on, all the same. Morning coffee, attempts to find a job, aimless walks through the monotonous streets. In the small town, life went slowly, as if its inhabitants had no rush to go anywhere. One evening, I began to feel suffocated in my room, and I decided to go out into the garden to get some fresh air. The rustling of the tree leaves was faint, and in the distance, a dog was barking. I walked closer to the garage where I heard the metallic clanging and muffled thuds. Daniel. I rarely saw him outside of the house, and when I did, it was only during dinner. In an impeccably ironed shirt, calmly polite, as was expected of a grown man who had chosen to tie his life to a woman with an adult daughter. But now he looked different. A simple t-shirt, jeans, messy hair, sleeves rolled up with traces of oil on his fingers. He was fixing something, absorbed in the process, and for a moment I thought this was a completely different person, not the one I had gotten used to. I stopped at the entrance, watching. He didn't notice me, entirely focused on his work. At one point, he wiped his forehead with his soiled hand, leaving a dark streak, and then suddenly looked in my direction. "Can't sleep?" His voice was even, but I caught a hint of surprise in it. "I just came out for some fresh air." I shrugged. He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward a chair by the wall. "Want to sit?" I didn't know why I agreed. I just stepped inside and sat down, looking around the garage. It wasn't chaotic. All the tools were neatly laid out, and the air smelled of metal and something warm, oily. "Do you always work in the evenings?" I asked. "When I feel like it," he replied, returning to his work. "Sometimes it's the only thing that helps turn off my brain." I paused, realizing that this was the first time I had heard something personal from him. "What do you think about when you work?" He smiled, shook his head. "A lot of things. Sometimes the past, sometimes the future. Sometimes I just think about why a bolt isn't tightening the way it should." For some reason, I liked this answer. It was simple, but there was something real about it. I didn't notice how much time had passed. I just sat there, watching him continue to fix something, occasionally explaining to me what each tool was for. At some point, I caught myself thinking that I liked his voice. Even calm, without unnecessary emotion, but with a hint of something alive. When I returned to my room, I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why this ordinary evening suddenly seemed so significant to me. My relationship with Ben felt like something unshakable. We had been together for several years, gone through arguments, periods of distance, but always came back to each other, almost by inertia. I had gotten used to him. His voice, the habit of adjusting the sleeves of his sweater, how he always forgot to charge his phone. But recently, I found myself more and more often feeling like we were just existing next to each other, not together. Our conversations had turned into a formality. How was your day? Fine. Yours? Same. Sometimes I would intentionally pause, hoping he would ask something more, but he would just nod and go back to his computer while I returned to my phone to kill time. That evening, I especially wanted to feel that there was still something between us. I texted him, suggesting we talk over video call. He replied with a short, okay. When the screen lit up, I saw his familiar face, a little tired, focused. Hey, I said, smiling. Hey. He looked away, clearly distracted by something. Are you busy? Maybe we should talk later. No, it's fine. Did something happen? That question struck a nerve. Why did something have to happen for us to just talk? No, I replied, holding back my irritation. I just wanted to talk. Ah, I see. Silence. Long, awkward. Ben, are we okay? He frowned. Why are you asking? I don't know. It feels like we've become strangers. What do you mean by strangers? We're still together. You've got your move. I've got work. That's normal. His voice was even, but not warm, as if I was bringing up a topic he didn't want to talk about. Do you even feel good with me? Of course I do. I'm with you, aren't I? That phrase, I'm with you? Somehow it broke me. I nodded, not wanting to push any further. After the call, I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. My chest felt empty. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, but deep inside, I already knew. We were losing each other. But no one wanted to admit it. The next day, I felt strangely empty. The conversation with Ben had left a lingering aftertaste that wouldn't go away. It felt like a wall had grown between us, but neither he nor I wanted to tear it down. It was easier to pretend that this was how things were supposed to be. I wanted to do something to drown out my thoughts. And then I came across an old bicycle in the garage. It had been a gift from my father. I had brought it with me, but hadn't used it in a long time. The tires were flat, the chain covered in rust, and the seat had peeled from age. I thought to myself, maybe I should fix it up? I brought a rag, a tool set, and sat right on the porch of the garage, starting to take apart the bike. I worked in silence, but my mind was racing. Have Ben and I always been like this? Or have I changed? I didn't notice when Daniel came out into the yard. I see you found yourself something to do, he said, stopping next to me. I looked up and shrugged. Yeah, I decided to fix it up, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to. I can help if you want. I hesitated, but I didn't refuse. He sat down beside me, took a tool, and began to dismantle the mechanism with ease. I watched his hands, strong, confident, knowing exactly what to do. Did you ever have a bike? I asked. Of course. When I was a kid, it was my way of escaping from home. I looked at him, surprised. Escape? He smiled. Figuratively speaking, I grew up in a small town like this one. The bike was my freedom. I could go anywhere as long as my parents didn't start looking for me. And where did you go? He paused for a moment, then shrugged. Anywhere. As long as the wind was in my face. I liked that comparison. We worked on the bike for about an hour. At some point, I realized I didn't want this moment to end. I felt at ease. Not like with Ben. No tense silences or forced conversations. Here, it was easy. When the bike was finally in working condition, I ran my hand over the handlebars. Thank you. I definitely couldn't have done it without you. Daniel smiled. I think you would have figured it out. But sometimes help isn't such a bad thing. I nodded. And when he left, I stood there for a long time, holding the bike, thinking about how this conversation had left me with more emotions than all our recent talks with Ben combined. Another argument with Ben happened suddenly, but if I'm honest, it had been building up for a long time. We were raising our voices, and then it quickly escalated into an exchange of biting remarks. "Have you ever thought about what I want?" he blurted out. "Have you thought about what's going on with me? Or is it just easier for you to pretend everything's fine?" He wearily rubbed his face with his hands. "You know, I don't understand why we're still doing this." That phrase stuck in my mind. When the call ended, I realized I just needed to leave the room. My chest tightened, like something inside me had broken. I went downstairs to get a glass of water, but when I entered the living room, I ran into Daniel. He was sitting in the chair, one leg crossed over the other, a book in his hands. The house was quiet, with only the ticking of the wall clock marking the seconds. "Is everything okay?" he asked without looking up from his book, but I could tell from his tone that he had noticed. I didn't answer right away. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and slowly took a sip. When I returned to the living room, he had already closed the book and was watching me. "Just a stupid day," I muttered, sitting down on the couch. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "What happened?" I hesitated. Talking to him felt strange, but at the same time, easy. "I don't know where Ben and I are headed," I admitted. Daniel nodded, waiting a few seconds as if giving me the chance to continue. He was such an important part of my life, but now I look at him and don't feel what I used to. It's like we're pulling each other, but not forward, just down. "Is it because of the move?" "Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't notice before that we've been drifting apart for a while, holding on to the habit." He silently looked at me, and in his gaze, there was no judgment, just understanding. "Sometimes we're afraid to admit the obvious," he said quietly. I lowered my gaze. "And have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life?" He gave a brief, dry laugh. "Of course." I expected him to say more, but instead, he picked up the book and tapped the spine against the armrest. "Sometimes you have to make a choice, even if it's an unpleasant one." That phrase stuck with me. I stood up, thanked him for the conversation, and went back to my room. But that night, I lay awake for hours, replaying his words over and over in my head. Mom was in an upbeat mood. Earlier that morning, she happily announced that she had planned a family trip to spend some time together. She chose a nearby town, small but cozy, with a lake, quaint shops, and cafes that smelled of fresh pastries. I didn't want to go. Not because of the company, but because of my own thoughts that were weighing me down. But refusing would have been too conspicuous. When we arrived, Mom, as expected, took on the role of the tour guide. She chatted nonstop, telling stories she found online, and I tried to keep up with the conversation, but my mind was elsewhere. We wandered through the little shops, stopped at a cafe where we ordered cinnamon coffee, and then went to the waterfront. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and a light breeze cooled my skin. I was walking a little behind everyone, lost in my thoughts, when I suddenly felt someone looking at me. Daniel. He was ahead of us, but at one point his gaze lingered on me. It wasn't the usual stepfather's glance, not a casual look. There was something different in it. I felt a tightness inside me. I turned away, but the realization had already hit me. What was supposed to be just a simple family outing had turned into something else. I found myself watching his movements, noticing the little things. How he adjusted the sleeves of his shirt, how a barely noticeable smile appeared on his lips when Mom said something funny. I needed to push this out of my mind. But by the end of the day, I knew I couldn't. I decided that I needed to set some boundaries, to draw a line. I needed to get back to what was normal, to what was familiar. So I called Ben. "How about we spend the evening together?" I asked, trying to make my voice sound light. "Sure." He was surprised, but agreed without hesitation. He made dinner, a simple pasta with cheese like he used to when he wanted to show he cared. We sat at the table, turned on a movie, the kind we picked by old habit. one we had both seen 1,000 times so we wouldn't be distracted by the plot. But I felt like a stranger in that evening. Ben was there. He leaned in to hug me, but I didn't feel anything. Just emptiness. "You seem distant," he muttered, pulling back. I shrugged. "I'm just tired." He looked at me for a long time, like he was trying to understand something, but didn't press further. The evening passed as it was meant to. Everything was fine, according to the script. But when I returned home and lay down in bed, I understood the truth. It wasn't about Ben. It was that I was no longer the person I once was. With each passing day, I noticed more and more how Mom seemed to be suspecting something. It wasn't obvious, but the little details were starting to add up. I found myself lingering in the kitchen longer whenever Daniel was there. Sometimes he would come to my room to help with something or just to chat. And every time we spoke, I could feel her watching us. At first, it was just fleeting glances. Then there were the long, silent pauses during dinner, when Mom would suddenly stare at me as if searching for something. She didn't say anything directly, but I knew. She was noticing the changes. One evening, as I was looking at Daniel again, Mom held her gaze on both of us. I tried to ignore it, but the tension in the room was palpable. I leaned slightly toward my plate, hoping she wouldn't say anything. But she didn't. She just kept eating, and I began to think maybe all of this was too obvious. But in that moment, I felt something else, as if she already understood something. And that feeling didn't leave me for the rest of the evening. The next morning, while we were sitting at the kitchen table, Mom suddenly asked, "Do you talk to him often?" I froze. The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them, but I quickly responded, "Yeah, he helps me with some things. That's all." Mom looked at me in silence, as if trying to dissect every word. "Are you sure?" Her question was quiet, but I could feel the weight of it. I nodded, unable to add anything else. Mom didn't say more, but I knew she had felt something. And now I was certain she would be watching my every move. I could no longer ignore everything that was happening around me. Every glance from Mom, every silence in the room felt heavy, like a burden I couldn't bear any longer. This was no longer just confusion. It was the realization that everything was slipping out of control, and I couldn't stop it. I decided to talk to Daniel. It wasn't easy, especially after noticing how Mom had already begun to pick up on everything. We met in the park, far from prying eyes, away from people. The park was empty, with only the rustling of leaves in the wind. We found a quiet spot on a bench, and I felt the pressure inside me growing with every passing moment. "I need to talk to you," I said, not meeting his gaze. Daniel looked at me, his face calm, but I could see his eyes narrowing slightly as he realized that I wasn't starting this conversation without reason. "What's going on?" I breathed in and out, trying to calm the storm inside. "We can't keep going like this," I said. "I can't keep pretending that everything's fine. You know Mom notices everything, and I can't lie to her. I can't keep hiding how I feel." Daniel remained silent, his face neutral, but I knew what he was thinking. I could see how much it was affecting him, how hard it was for him. And it was hard for me too. I felt my heart racing. I had always thought I could handle this on my own, but now I realized I couldn't. "I understand," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "You're right. We can't keep going like this. I didn't want this to become a problem, but I also can't just pretend nothing's happening." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and pain, knowing that I was severing something that had felt important. It was a decision that changed everything. But I knew there was no other way. When he stood up and left, I stayed sitting on the bench, feeling the silence around me grow painfully loud. I closed my eyes, trying to understand what would come next. Several days passed, and I thought I would be able to put everything back in place. I decided I needed to talk to Mom, explain that everything was fine, and that it wasn't as important as it seemed. But when I came home that day, I immediately sensed something was wrong. I heard Mom's voice, but it was strange, sharp. I headed to the living room and stopped at the door. Mom was sitting on the couch, holding my phone in her hands, and the expression on her face was a mixture of pain and anger that I couldn't immediately understand. Daniel was standing nearby, looking agitated, almost bewildered. Mom. I took a step forward, trying to figure out what had happened. She looked up and stared at me as if she didn't recognize me. Are you out of your mind? Her voice was low and trembling. What is this? She raised my phone, and I saw that my messages with Daniel were open on the screen. I felt the lump in my throat tighten, choking my breath. I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. You always told me everything was fine, Mom continued. And now this. Don't you understand what you're doing? I tried to move closer, to take the phone from her, but she pulled back, not letting me. The look on her face was filled with so much disappointment that I felt physically sick. Daniel was standing there, but he didn't intervene. His silence, his presence had become alien to me, like he was part of something that I could no longer control. Mom, I didn't know how to continue. I saw the pain twisting her face, but I couldn't change anything. You're not my daughter if you're behaving like this. You've destroyed everything we tried to build. You've betrayed me. Her words hit me like knives, piercing my chest. Daniel sighed and, without saying a word, gathered his things. He was ready to leave. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. When he left, I was alone in the empty house with a mom who was no longer the person I had known. The silence in the room was so heavy, it felt like I couldn't breathe. I could feel everything around me crumbling. Several days passed, and I still couldn't understand what had happened. Daniel had left, and our house became quiet. Mom stopped talking to me, as if I had become a stranger to her. At first, she tried to pretend that nothing had changed, but I could see how her gaze grew colder, how she avoided meeting my eyes. Ben left too. He just packed his things without a word. I tried to stop him, to apologize, to explain that all of this was a mistake, that I didn't know how it had happened, but he didn't listen anymore. His words didn't make sense. You don't even understand what you've done. And then he was gone, without looking back. I was left alone. Everything that once felt so stable in my life had turned into one big empty space. I sat in my old chair, staring out the window, trying to piece myself together. It was in that moment that I realized everything I had once thought about myself, about all these relationships, about Ben, about Daniel. It had all been built on illusions. I had tried to find answers in other people, in their support, in their opinions, in their attachments. But the truth was different. The truth was inside me. I thought for a long time about how to avoid the pain, how to stop feeling the emptiness. I tried to fix everything, put it all back in place, but now I understood that it doesn't work like that. You can't just take the sand from an excavated hole and make it take its old shape again. I realized that I had to sort myself out. It was the only thing I could do. I couldn't get Ben back. I couldn't get Daniel back. And I couldn't get back what had been before everything fell apart. But I could become someone new. I started by stopping the search for comfort in other people. I began listening to myself more. I returned to doing the things that had once calmed me. Riding my bike, reading books, walking in silence. I didn't need approval from others. I just wanted to find what was important to me. And at some point, sitting on the same porch where I had once met Daniel, I realized I was no longer afraid of being alone. And maybe, just maybe, now I could figure out who I truly was. Several months passed. Mom and I still didn't speak, and perhaps that was for the best for both of us. Time helped us step back a little, helped us cool down from the pain that had filled our home. I understood that she would never forgive me for what had happened, and all I could do was accept that. I began spending more and more time outside, riding my bike. It became both my loss and my salvation. The wind in my face, the sound of the wheels, the blurred images passing behind me. It was the moment when all the troubling thoughts faded away, and I was left only with myself. One evening, I returned home, feeling the wear in my muscles from the long ride. I took off my helmet and placed it on the table, as usual. I sat down in the kitchen to drink some water and rest for a bit. And then, like thunder out of the blue, I heard Mom's voice. She stood in the doorway, slightly bewildered, with a clear intention to say something important. "You're home. I. She hesitated, then took a step forward. "I need to talk to you." I felt the air in the room shift slightly. I looked at her, and in that moment, I realized that there was no longer that old fear inside me, the fear that used to hold me back. I wasn't waiting for her forgiveness, and I wasn't looking for comfort in her words. I was just waiting to hear what she would say. "I know you probably don't expect things to be the way they were before," Mom began, sitting down across from me. "And I'm not sure I'll ever forgive you, but I don't want to stay in this silence anymore. We both need change." Her words hung in the air. It was at that moment I realized that she had changed too. She wasn't the same as she had been before, just as I had changed. "I want you to know that I'm not angry at you. I don't know how to make everything right again, but I'm willing to try. To start something new, at least to try to understand each other. We're still family, aren't we?" I didn't know what to say. 1,000 thoughts were spinning in my mind, but I just nodded. It was the first step. Mom was finally ready to face me. This didn't mean everything would be easy, that everything would be perfect again, but it was a chance for healing. I sat beside her. "Let's start with something simple. How are you? How are you feeling?" Mom sighed, looking out the window. "Different. Sometimes I feel lost, but sometimes when I see you outside on your bike, I realize that maybe we can still be happy, but in a different way." I smiled, because I understood. This was the beginning of a new path, a path that would be slow, difficult, and often full of doubt. But it was ours, and that was the most important thing. After that conversation with Mom, everything changed, but the changes were slow. We didn't become best friends overnight, and we didn't return to our old relationship as if nothing had happened. But gradually, step by step, we began to rebuild what had been broken. Mom started coming into my room more often, sometimes just sitting silently beside me while I read. It was strange but soothing. Sometimes she would ask about my walks, about my bike, about how I was feeling. I answered calmly, but there was a sincerity in those questions that had been missing before. I realized that now all my attention was focused not on proving something to someone, but on understanding myself. I spent a lot of time thinking about what had happened, what had led me to Daniel, what had brought me to the breakup, and what I needed for myself to avoid repeating those mistakes in the future. I wasn't looking for the perfect person. I started looking for myself. I began focusing on doing what I enjoyed, what brought me joy. I found myself riding my bike more often, finding my freedom and my rhythm in those rides. One day, I decided to return to the town where it all began, the place where I once thought I would find my happiness. I went back to that same park, the one where Daniel and I had last talked. Everything was just as it had been. The trees, the benches, the silence. I sat on the same bench and simply listened to the wind rustling through the leaves. It was the beginning of healing, not just externally, but internally. I realized that I no longer needed someone else to give me answers. I could handle the tough moments on my own. And in that was freedom. In accepting my mistakes, in forgiving myself, and in understanding that life won't always be perfect. But that doesn't mean it's not worth living. Later, Mom called me, and I knew the conversation would be long, but that was okay. We began talking about how everything had changed, about what we needed to do to keep moving forward. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew it would be okay. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. We had learned how to move on. With each passing day, things got easier. There were still tough moments, but more and more, I noticed that a sense of calm was returning. The feeling that life would continue, no matter how long it would take to rebuild what was lost. I started teaching myself not to rush, not to expect a quick return to normal. It took patience, but maybe that was the essence of change. A few weeks later, I returned home from one of my usual bike rides. It was late, and the sky was already darkening. I took off my helmet and walked through the backyard into the house, but I noticed the kitchen light was on. I thought Mom had stayed up late again, but as I got closer, I saw the door was slightly ajar. I entered the house cautiously, and as soon as I stepped through the threshold, I heard her voice. She was talking to someone on the phone. I paused for a moment, then walked into the kitchen. "Hi," I said. Mom put the phone down and looked at me. She smiled, and I noticed that the smile wasn't just a formality. It was real, genuine. We didn't say much that evening, but I understood that we had started to be on the same wavelength. It was so simple, and yet so significant. "How was your day?" she asked, pulling out some ingredients from the fridge for dinner. "Good. I wrote on the old routes. I think next week I'll try some new ones." She nodded and smiled. "You've probably gotten used to these rides, huh?" I slowed down for a moment, thinking. Yeah, I've started to feel like I really need them. To understand where I am and who I am. It's like coming back to myself. She didn't say anything, but I could see how attentively she was listening. And that mattered. I never imagined we'd sit at dinner and just share moments like this. I hadn't expected that such a simple gesture would carry such a profound change. I realized that both Mom and I weren't rushing to return everything to how it was. We were starting to build a new bridge between us, step by step. And in that moment, I understood that it wasn't necessary to try to control everything. Sometimes it's more important to be ready to accept change and allow yourself to move forward, despite the pain and loss. It didn't matter how much time it would take. What mattered was only one thing: the return home. And for the first time, I truly felt like I was home.